3 entire Roman legions, over 20,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, gone. Not just defeated, completely annihilated in 3 brutal days. This wasn't some glorious clash of armies on an open battlefield. This was a massacre so complete, so devastating, that it shattered the very idea of Roman invincibility forever. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. How could the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, the masters of the entire Mediterranean, the conquerors of Gaul and Egypt, fall victim to what they called barbarian tribes in a muddy, fog-covered German forest? You see, Rome had never experienced anything like this. Sure, they'd lost battles before, but 3 entire legions? The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, some of the most elite fighting forces in the ancient world, simply vanished into the German wilderness. When news reached Emperor Augustus in Rome, he was so devastated that he reportedly spent months banging his head against the walls of his palace, crying out, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions." And here's the twist that makes this story even more incredible. The man who orchestrated this catastrophe wasn't some wild barbarian chief. He was Arminius, a Germanic prince who had been raised in Rome, educated in Roman schools, trained in Roman military tactics, and had even earned Roman citizenship. He knew exactly how the legions fought, how they thought, and most importantly, how they could be destroyed. Today, we're going to unravel the extraordinary story of the Teutoburg Forest, a tale where betrayal, brilliant strategy, and the raw power of nature itself conspired to create Rome's darkest hour. We'll discover how a forest became a graveyard, how trust became a weapon, and how 3 days in the year 9 after Christ changed the course of Western civilization forever. But here's the thing, this isn't just ancient history. The echoes of Teutoburg still shape our world today. The borders it created, the lessons it taught about imperial overreach, and the reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is truly invincible. So stick with me until the very end, because what happened in that German forest 2,000 years ago holds secrets that every modern superpower should remember. Before we march into this incredible story, smash that like button, subscribe to Imperium Chronicles, and join us as we march into the past. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of this epic tale of betrayal, blood, and the day Rome learned its limits. Now, to understand how this disaster happened, we need to go back about 20 years before the massacre, to the mind of Emperor Augustus himself. Picture Rome at the height of its power. They had just conquered Egypt, Gaul was pacified, and the Mediterranean had become what Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Augustus wasn't just content with what Rome already had. He had a vision, a dream of what he called Greater Rome, an empire that would stretch from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Elbe River in Germany. But here's what's fascinating about Augustus. This wasn't just military ambition. The man genuinely believed he was bringing civilization to the barbaric world. In his mind, Roman law, Roman roads, Roman baths, and Roman order were gifts to humanity. Germania, with its dense forests and tribal warriors, was simply the next frontier to be enlightened. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Augustus chose a man named Publius Quinctilius Varus to be the governor of this new Germanic province. Now, Varus wasn't just any politician. He was Augustus's own relative by marriage, wealthy beyond measure, and had successfully governed Syria, one of Rome's most challenging provinces. On paper, he was the perfect choice. But here's the problem. Varus had learned all his lessons in the East, where people were used to being ruled by empires. Syria had been conquered by Persians, Greeks, and now Romans. The locals there understood taxation, understood bureaucracy, understood submission. Varus thought Germania would be exactly the same. What's absolutely mind-boggling is how completely Varus misunderstood the Germanic tribes. These weren't people who had been conquered before. They were fiercely independent warriors who had never bowed to any foreign power. But Varus, he saw some cooperative tribal chiefs. He saw Roman merchants setting up shop. He saw Germanic young men joining Roman auxiliary units, and he thought, mission accomplished. Germania is pacified. Here's a detail that perfectly captures Roman arrogance. Varus actually set up Roman law courts in Germania. Picture this. He's literally sitting in judgment over Germanic disputes, imposing Roman legal procedures on people whose entire culture was based on personal honor and tribal loyalty. The Germanic warriors would come to these courts, see this foreign governor deciding their fates according to foreign laws, and you can imagine the rage building beneath the surface. But the most incredible part of Roman delusion was their attitude toward Germanic culture itself. Romans genuinely believed that once the barbarians experienced Roman civilization, the roads, the buildings, the order, they would naturally want to become Roman. They couldn't conceive that some people might actually prefer their own way of life to Roman rule. What Augustus and Varus failed to understand was that beneath all those diplomatic smiles and cooperative gestures, a massive resistance movement was brewing. The Germanic tribes weren't pacified. They were planning. They weren't grateful for Roman civilization. They were furious about Roman occupation. And they weren't divided. They were secretly uniting under a leader who understood Romans better than Romans understood themselves. The irony is absolutely perfect. While Varus was writing reports back to Rome about how successfully Germania was being integrated into the empire, the very people he thought he controlled were preparing the most devastating ambush in Roman military history. Rome's greatest strength, their absolute confidence in their own superiority, had become their greatest weakness. But now comes the plot twist that makes this story absolutely incredible. The man who would orchestrate Rome's greatest military disaster wasn't some wild, barbarian chief who had never seen Roman civilization. No. This is where the story becomes the ultimate tale of revenge, betrayal, and poetic justice. Meet Arminius, though that wasn't even his real name. His Germanic name was Hermann, but the Romans had given him a proper Roman name when they took him from his tribe as a young boy. And here's what makes this story so fascinating. Arminius wasn't captured in battle or stolen in a raid. He was given to Rome as part of a diplomatic agreement, a hostage to ensure his tribe's good behavior. Picture this young Germanic prince, maybe 8 or 9 years old, torn away from the forests and warrior culture of his people and thrust into the marble halls of Roman civilization. But here's the thing. Rome didn't just imprison their hostages. They had a brilliant system. They would educate these foreign princes, give them the best Roman tutors, teach them Latin literature and philosophy, and train them in Roman military tactics. The idea was genius. Turn potential enemies into loyal Roman allies by making them Roman. And by every measure, it worked perfectly with Arminius. This kid was a star student. He mastered Latin so well he could quote Virgil and Cicero. He studied Roman history, Roman law, Roman engineering. But most importantly, he became an absolutely brilliant military officer. We're talking about someone who understood Roman battle formations, Roman logistics, Roman strategy better than most Roman-born generals. Here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. Arminius didn't just serve in the Roman army. He excelled. He earned Roman citizenship, which was an incredible honor for a foreigner. He was awarded military decorations for bravery in battle. Roman officers respected him. Roman soldiers followed him into combat, and Varus himself considered Arminius one of his most trusted advisors. But here's the detail that gives me chills every time I think about it. While Arminius was sitting in Roman war councils, learning Roman tactics, earning Roman trust, he was secretly planning the destruction of Rome itself. This wasn't some sudden decision or crime of passion. This was a long-term, carefully calculated plot for revenge that had been brewing for decades. Imagine the psychological complexity of this man. By day, he's the perfect Roman officer, speaking Latin, following Roman customs, commanding Roman auxiliary troops. But every night, he's remembering his childhood in the Germanic forests, remembering his people's freedom, and planning how to use everything Rome taught him to destroy Rome. And here's what makes this betrayal so personally devastating for the Romans. Arminius wasn't just any Germanic leader. He had become part of the Roman family. Varus trusted him completely. Roman officers shared their strategies with him. He knew exactly how many troops were stationed where. He knew the Roman supply lines. He knew their weaknesses and their strengths. But the most incredible part of Arminius's plan was how he managed to unite the Germanic tribes. Remember, these were people who had been fighting each other for generations. The Cherushi, the Marsi, the Chatti. They were traditional enemies. But Arminius spoke their languages, understood their cultures, and most importantly, he could offer them something no Germanic leader had ever offered before, a guaranteed way to defeat Rome. Think about the conversations he must have had with other tribal chiefs. Here's this man who looks Germanic, speaks Germanic, but can also explain exactly how Roman legions fight, how they can be beaten, and how the tribes can work together to achieve something that seemed impossible, driving Rome out of Germania forever. The ultimate irony? Rome created their own destroyer. Every lesson they taught Arminius, every tactic they showed him, every piece of trust they gave him, he was storing it all up to use against them. Rome thought they were creating a loyal ally, but they were actually training the architect of their greatest defeat. This isn't just military history. This is one of the greatest revenge stories ever told. A boy taken from his people, educated by his enemies, trusted by his captors, and then using everything they gave him to destroy them. It's like something out of a Hollywood thriller, except it's absolutely real and it changed the course of Western civilization. Now comes the moment when all of Arminius's planning, all of his patience, all of his brilliant deception finally springs into action. And the setting couldn't have been more perfect for what he had in mind. Picture the Teutoburg Forest in September of the year 9 after Christ. This isn't some pleasant woodland. We're talking about a massive ancient forest that stretched for hundreds of miles across northern Germania. Imagine trees so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground even on a clear day. Twisted paths that even local hunters could get lost in. Swampy ground that could swallow a horse and rider whole. And on this particular September, it had been raining for days. Now, here's what's absolutely crucial to understand. Roman legions were the ultimate fighting machine of the ancient world, but only when they could fight the way they were trained to fight. Roman tactics were all about discipline, formation, and open space. The famous testudo or tortoise formation, where soldiers locked their shields together. Useless in dense forest, the precise javelin throws that could devastate enemy lines. Can't work when you can't see 50 feet ahead. The disciplined marching formations that struck fear into enemies across the Mediterranean. Completely impossible on narrow forest paths. Arminius knew all of this because he had trained with Roman legions. He had seen firsthand how these incredible warriors became just confused, frightened men when they couldn't fight as a unit. And so he chose his battlefield with the precision of a master chess player. But here's the genius part of his plan. Arminius didn't just pick the forest randomly. He had spent months, maybe years, preparing this specific stretch of woodland. His warriors had built hidden barricades disguised as fallen logs. They had dug covered pits along the paths. They had even constructed wooden walls behind the trees, invisible from the Roman perspective, but perfect defensive positions for Germanic fighters. Now picture this from Varus's point of view. He's marching with 3 full legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, plus auxiliary troops, camp followers, supply wagons, everything. We're talking about maybe 25,000 people stretched out in a column that's probably 15 miles long, all struggling through muddy forest paths in the pouring rain. And Arminius? He's right there next to Varus, playing the role of loyal Roman ally, offering helpful advice about the best routes through the forest. Oh, there's been some minor tribal unrest over here, General Varus. Nothing serious, but perhaps we should take this slightly longer route to avoid any complications. Can you imagine the psychological strength it took to maintain that deception while knowing what was about to happen? Here's what makes the tactical situation so brilliant. Arminius had positioned thousands of Germanic warriors throughout the forest, but they weren't going to attack all at once like a traditional battle. No, this was going to be a systematic destruction. Groups of Romans would be isolated and overwhelmed, one section at a time, while the rest of the column couldn't even see what was happening through the trees and rain. The attack began with what seemed like minor harassment. A few javelins thrown from the forest, some whooping war cries, arrows shot from invisible positions. The Romans formed up as best they could, but here's the problem. They're on a narrow path with dense forest on both sides, heavy rain limiting visibility, and they can't see their attackers. It's like trying to fight ghosts. And then came the moment that sealed their fate. Arminius suddenly disappeared. One moment he's giving advice to Varus. The next moment he's vanished into the forest. The Romans probably thought he'd gone to scout or coordinate with local allies. They had no idea he had just gone to take command of the forces that were about to destroy them. What happened next was tactical genius combined with natural brutality. Germanic warriors, who knew every tree and path in that forest, began systematically collapsing the Roman column. They would attack one section, force the Romans to deploy and fight, then disappear back into the forest before reinforcements could arrive. Meanwhile, other groups were attacking the supply train, the rear guard, isolated units that had gotten separated in the chaos. Here's a detail that gives me chills. Archaeologists have found Roman equipment buried in the mud of that forest for nearly 2,000 years. Swords, helmets, armor, coins, all scattered across miles of woodland and buried by centuries of rain and decay. Did you know archaeologists still find Roman equipment buried in the mud? If you're gripped by this story, like, share, and comment. Could Rome have avoided this disaster? But the most terrifying part for the Romans was the psychological warfare. They could hear the sounds of battle from different parts of the column, but they couldn't see what was happening. They could hear Germanic war cries echoing through the forest, but they couldn't tell where the attacks were coming from. The rain was washing away the sounds and the scents that soldiers rely on to understand a battlefield. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where death could come from any direction at any moment. The forest itself had become a weapon, and Arminius was wielding it like a master swordsman. What happened next was 3 days of systematic horror that would haunt the Roman Empire for generations. This wasn't a quick, glorious battle that you read about in epic poems. This was a slow, methodical destruction of 3 of Rome's finest legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, carried out with a precision that would make modern military strategists shudder. Day 1 began with confusion and hope. The Romans still believed they could fight their way out. These were hardened veterans who had conquered Gaul, who had marched with Caesar, who had never known defeat. When the first attacks came, they did what Roman soldiers always did. They formed up, they fought back, they maintained discipline. But the forest was their enemy as much as the Germanic warriors. Picture this nightmare. You're a Roman centurion trying to maintain formation, but your men are strung out along a muddy path that's barely wide enough for a single wagon. Every time you try to deploy into proper battle formation, there are trees in the way. Every time you think you've located the enemy, they vanish back into the forest like ghosts. Your shields are getting heavier with each passing hour as the rain soaks through everything. Your javelins are useless because you can't see targets more than a few dozen yards away. But here's what made it truly terrifying. The Germanic warriors weren't fighting like barbarians at all. They were fighting with Roman discipline, Roman tactics, Roman intelligence, because Arminius had taught them everything. They knew exactly when to attack, when to retreat, how to isolate units, how to cut supply lines. It was like fighting a mirror image of themselves, except the mirror knew all their weaknesses. By the end of day 1, the Roman column was broken into dozens of isolated groups, each fighting for survival in their own private hell. Some units managed to build temporary camps, but they were surrounded, cut off from supplies, and slowly being picked apart by Germanic raids throughout the night. Day 2 was when hope began to die. The Roman soldiers woke up to discover that their situation had gotten worse, not better. More of their comrades were dead. Their supplies were running out. The rain kept falling, turning the forest floor into a swamp that sucked at their boots with every step. And everywhere they looked, they could see the evidence of Germanic preparation. Those wooden walls behind the trees, those carefully constructed barriers, those strategically placed obstacles that turned every path into a death trap. But here's the detail that really shows how desperate things had become. Roman soldiers began breaking ranks. These were men who had been trained from childhood to never abandon their positions, to never retreat without orders, to die before dishonoring their eagle standards. But in that forest, with their officers dead or separated, with no hope of rescue, with Germanic war cries echoing through the trees, even the most disciplined soldiers began to panic. Some tried to surrender, but here's the brutal reality. Germanic tribes didn't take many prisoners, especially not Roman soldiers who had been occupying their lands. Those who were captured faced torture, sacrifice to Germanic gods, or slavery. Word of this spread through the remaining Roman forces, and that's when something happened that shocked even the Germanic warriors who witnessed it. Roman soldiers began killing themselves rather than face capture. We're talking about professional warriors, men who had faced death in battle countless times, choosing to fall on their own swords rather than be taken alive. Centurions who had led men into battle across the empire were found dead by their own hands, their bodies lying next to the eagle standards they had sworn to protect. Day 3 was the final collapse. By now, the 3 legions had been reduced to scattered bands of survivors, exhausted, hungry, and completely demoralized. Varus himself, the overconfident governor who had believed Germania was pacified, realized that he had led his men into a trap from which there was no escape. And here's the tragic irony. The man who had underestimated Germanic warriors so completely ended up following the Roman tradition of taking his own life rather than face capture. When Varus fell on his sword, it was effectively the end of Roman resistance. Some small groups of soldiers fought on for hours more, but the outcome was inevitable. 3 entire legions, over 15,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, had been annihilated. The Germanic tribes had achieved something that seemed impossible. They had completely destroyed a major Roman army. Now, here's where the story gets even more incredible. When news of this disaster reached Rome, it took weeks for the full scope of the catastrophe to become clear. Remember, this was before modern communications. The first reports probably just said there had been some trouble in Germania. Then came word that Varus had been killed. Then the horrifying realization that entire legions had vanished. Emperor Augustus, the man who had created the Roman Empire, who had brought peace and prosperity to the Mediterranean world, who had never experienced a military disaster of this magnitude, completely lost his composure. Ancient historians tell us that he would spend hours banging his head against the walls of his palace, crying out, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions!" Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man in the world, reduced to a grief-stricken old man, begging a dead general to somehow undo a catastrophe that couldn't be undone. Augustus was so traumatized by Teutoburg that he reportedly refused to cut his hair or beard for months, and he would wake up in the middle of the night shouting Varus's name. But here's what makes Augustus's reaction even more significant. He immediately understood that this wasn't just a military defeat. This was a complete failure of Roman strategy, Roman intelligence, and Roman assumptions about their own invincibility. The empire that had conquered the known world had been outwitted by the very people they had dismissed as barbarians. Now you might think that Rome, being Rome, would immediately raise new legions and march back into Germania for revenge. And you'd be partially right. But the story of Roman revenge is far more complicated and ultimately tragic than you might expect. Augustus was devastated, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that rushing back into Germania with the same tactics that had failed so catastrophically would just lead to more disasters. So instead, he did something that was almost unprecedented for Rome. He pulled back. The great expansionist empire that had always responded to defeat with overwhelming force decided to consolidate rather than advance. But the ghosts of Teutoburg wouldn't let Rome rest. The loss of 3 entire legions, the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by barbarians, the psychological trauma of discovering their own limitations. It all festered in the Roman consciousness like an infected wound. Enter Germanicus, Augustus's adopted grandson and one of Rome's most brilliant generals. Now here's a man who had everything: royal blood, military genius, the love of his soldiers, and most importantly, a burning desire to restore Roman honor in Germania. When Augustus died and Tiberius became emperor, Germanicus convinced him to let him launch what would become one of the most extensive military campaigns in Roman history. For 6 years, from 14 to 20 after Christ, Germanicus led massive expeditions across the Rhine. And when I say massive, I mean he was bringing 8 legions at a time. That's nearly 50,000 professional soldiers, plus auxiliaries, plus supply trains. This wasn't just military action. This was Rome showing the world that they were still the dominant power. And here's the fascinating part. Germanicus was actually successful in many ways. His legions crushed Germanic tribes in open battle, burned villages, captured thousands of prisoners, and most symbolically important, recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards from the Teutoburg disaster. When those eagles were brought back to Rome, the crowds went absolutely wild. It was like recovering pieces of the Roman soul that had been lost in that dark forest. But here's what's absolutely incredible about these campaigns. Despite all of Germanicus's victories, despite recovering the eagles, despite years of Roman military dominance, Germania was never truly conquered. The tribes would submit when Roman legions were present, then revolt the moment the legions moved on. It was like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. The harder Rome squeezed, the more Germania slipped through their fingers. The most revealing moment came when Germanicus actually found the Teutoburg battlefield. Picture this. It's been nearly 7 years since the massacre, and Roman soldiers are walking through this forest, finding the bones of their comrades still scattered where they fell. They found skulls nailed to trees, Germanic trophies from the battle. They found Roman weapons still lying in the mud. They found the remains of the altars where Germanic priests had sacrificed Roman prisoners to their gods. Germanicus ordered his men to bury the remains of their fallen comrades, but think about the psychological impact of that moment. Here were Roman soldiers, the supposed masters of the world, collecting the bones of their predecessors who had been defeated by the very people they were now fighting. It was a powerful reminder that Roman invincibility was a myth that had already been shattered. And then came the moment that really shows you how this story ends. Arminius and Germanicus actually met on the battlefield. The Germanic prince who had been raised in Rome facing off against the Roman prince who had come to avenge Rome's honor. It should have been the ultimate showdown, the climactic battle that decided the fate of Germania once and for all. But you know what happened? Nothing decisive. They fought, people died, and Germania remained unconquered. Arminius proved that he could still outmaneuver Roman legions, and Germanicus proved that Rome could still win battles, but neither could deliver the knockout blow that would end the conflict permanently. The real turning point came when Emperor Tiberius made a decision that changed European history forever. He recalled Germanicus and declared that the Rhine River would be Rome's permanent eastern border. Think about the significance of that moment. Rome, the empire that had always expanded, that had always pushed forward, that had conquered everyone from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, officially admitted that there were some places they simply couldn't conquer. That decision created a border that lasted for 400 years and shaped the development of Europe in ways we still see today. Western Europe became Romanized. They got Roman roads, Roman laws, Roman culture, Roman Christianity. Eastern Europe, including most of Germany, remained tribal, remained Germanic, developed along completely different lines. Here's a mind-blowing thought. If Teutoburg hadn't happened, if Varus hadn't been deceived, if those 3 legions hadn't been destroyed, Roman legions might have marched all the way to the Baltic Sea. German culture as we know it might never have developed. The medieval Holy Roman Empire might never have existed. The entire course of European history would have been completely different. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of Teutoburg is this. Rome never got its revenge. Not really. They recovered some eagles. They won some battles. They killed some Germanic warriors. But Arminius died in his bed, never conquered by Rome. Germania remained free, and the empire that had seemed destined to rule the entire world learned that there were limits to Roman power that no amount of military might could overcome. So what does this incredible story teach us, 2,000 years later? Teutoburg wasn't just a battle. It was the moment Rome learned its limits. In those 3 days of rain and blood in a German forest, the mightiest empire in human history discovered that no power, no matter how dominant, is truly invincible. Think about it. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean, defeated Hannibal, crushed the Greek kingdoms, and seemed unstoppable. But Arminius proved something that every empire throughout history has had to learn the hard way. Pride always precedes the fall. Roman arrogance, Roman assumptions about their own superiority, Roman inability to truly understand the people they were trying to conquer. These weren't just military mistakes, they were fatal flaws in the Roman worldview. But here's what makes this story so relevant today. Arminius succeeded not through superior numbers or better weapons, but through superior intelligence. He understood his enemy better than they understood themselves. He used Rome's own strengths against them, turned their confidence into complacency, their trust into vulnerability. In our modern world of global superpowers and international conflicts, these lessons feel incredibly current. And there's something else that gives me chills about this story. It shows how quickly the impossible can become inevitable. On the morning that Varus led his legions into the Teutoburg Forest, the idea that 3 entire Roman legions could be wiped out by Germanic tribes would have seemed absurd to any Roman citizen. By evening of the 3rd day, it was historical fact. Sometimes history turns on a single moment, a single decision, a single betrayal. Next time you hear politicians or pundits talking about the clash of civilizations, remember Teutoburg. Remember that history doesn't just turn on grand strategies and massive armies. It turns on betrayal, reign, and choices made in shadows. It turns on one man's ability to see through the facade of power to the weakness beneath. It turns on the willingness of people to fight for their freedom even when the odds seem impossible. What lessons does Teutoburg hold for today's superpowers? Maybe it's that no amount of military might can force people to accept foreign rule if they're determined to resist. Maybe it's that understanding your enemy's culture and motivations is more important than having superior weapons. Maybe it's that the most dangerous opponents are often those who understand you better than you understand yourself. Or maybe the lesson is simpler, that empires, like people, are mortal. Rome seemed eternal to the Romans, but Teutoburg was the beginning of the end of their expansion. The Rhine frontier that Tiberius established after Teutoburg held for 4 centuries, but it was still a frontier, a line that said, this far and no further. And eventually, even that line couldn't hold. But here's the most powerful lesson of all. Arminius didn't just defeat Rome in battle. He preserved something precious, the independence and cultural identity of his people. The Germanic tribes that fought at Teutoburg became the ancestors of medieval Germany, of the Holy Roman Empire, of the modern nations of Central Europe. Without Teutoburg, European history would have been completely different. One man's refusal to accept foreign domination changed the world. One battle in a muddy forest preserved the diversity of human civilization. One moment of betrayal, though maybe we should call it loyalty to his own people, echoed through the centuries. That's the real power of history. It reminds us that the world we live in today was shaped by individuals who made choices, often in desperate circumstances, that seemed small at the time but had enormous consequences. Teutoburg teaches us that no empire is permanent, no victory is final, and no cause is hopeless if people are willing to fight for it. So what do you think? Could Rome have avoided this disaster? Was Arminius a traitor or a hero? What lessons does this ancient story hold for our modern world? Let's discuss below. I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on this incredible piece of history. If this video shook you like a Germanic war cry echoing through the forest, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more epic histories. We've got so many more incredible stories to tell. Tales of triumph and tragedy, betrayal and heroism, moments that changed the world forever. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got to where we are today, and maybe, just maybe, learning something that can help us navigate the challenges ahead. This is Imperium Chronicles, signing off. Thanks for marching into the past with us today.